Building on our discussion of consciousness and conceptual thinking, let's dive into how this particular theory holds up. How do we know if it's not just hot air? Well, a good theory, like any solid piece of work, needs to connect with reality. It should be able to look at things we already know and say, aha, that fits perfectly within my framework. Think of it as showing its homework, explaining existing puzzles, tidying up old ideas, maybe even pointing us towards exciting new questions to explore. The big claim here is that everything from telling apart two slightly different sounds to forming abstract concepts boils down to one fundamental process: classification. And this isn't happening in some ethereal realm. It's happening through a network of nerve impulses, buzzing away in our brains. The crucial bit is that what we experience depends on where an impulse lands in this complex web, not just what the impulse is. This simple idea has some pretty big consequences for how we think about brain damage, learning, and perception itself. Okay, so if mental qualities are all about position in the network, what does that mean practically? First off, it throws a wrench into the classic idea of localization. You know, the notion that seeing is over here, hearing is over there, and so on, neatly mapped out on the cortex. Our theory says not so fast. If the quality depends on where the impulse ends up in the grand scheme of connections, then maybe the specific patch of cortex doesn't matter as much as we thought. Imagine trying to find the exact spot for the taste of chocolate in your brain. It's probably spread out. So, prediction number 1. We don't need fixed addresses for mental functions. Prediction number 2 flows from this. The type of sensation you get, say, red versus blue, depends more on the whole system being intact and properly connected than on a specific little area being perfectly preserved. What should we expect? If you damage a chunk of cortex, you'd likely see a general slowdown or weakening across many mental abilities, rather than suddenly losing the ability to recognize faces, but keeping perfect pitch. And guess what? That's exactly what we observe. Damage hits broadly, not just specific functions. Now let's talk about backup plans. If the quality of a mental event relies on a whole network, what happens if part of that network goes down? Well, no single connection is absolutely essential. Think of it like a highway system. You can block one road, but traffic can still flow via others. Similarly, if the full classification of a sensation involves many pathways, any single pathway can be bypassed. Or sometimes, even a partial classification using a subset of connections might be enough to produce a usable result. This leads to two cool predictions. First, if a pathway is damaged, maybe you can relearn the function using different pathways, like rerouting traffic after a bridge collapse. Second, maybe there are multiple ways to wire up the same association. If one route gets cut, another takes over. This phenomenon, where the brain finds alternative routes, is known as substitutive functioning or equipotentiality. And yes, these aren't just theoretical musings. They've been observed and described in the lab. It's like the brain has built-in redundancy, which is pretty neat for survival. Alright, moving on to time. If translating a neural impulse into a conscious experience is a classification process, does that happen instantly? Or is there a ramp-up? Our theory suggests it's definitely not instantaneous. It's a process and it unfolds over time. Think about recognizing something. It starts subtly, maybe unconsciously, then becomes clearer. We should see different stages, different levels of clarity. From barely registering a stimulus, to getting a vague sense subception, to becoming aware of it presensation. Then finally, full-blown sensation, perception, maybe even conscious awareness apperception, and eventually leading to judgments or forming concepts. It's like going from a blurry photo to a sharp, detailed image. And does this developmental chain exist? Absolutely. Experience tells us this progression is real. We all go through these stages, consciously or not, every time we perceive anything. It confirms that the journey from raw signal to meaningful thought is gradual and structured. Here's a really interesting one. Context matters. If the quality of what we feel or see depends on its position in the network, and that position is influenced by other ongoing signals, then the same physical stimulus shouldn't always feel the same. Imagine tasting wine. In a fancy restaurant, it might taste exquisite. At home, maybe just okay. The wine itself hasn't changed, but the context, the setting, the mood, the expectations alters the sensory quality. Our theory predicts precisely this. The same receptor firing, the same initial impulse, can lead to different perceived qualities depending on what else is going on simultaneously. Is this just hand-waving? Nope. Experimental work backs this up. Many stimuli are perceived correctly only under normal conditions. Change the environment, introduce other stimuli, and suddenly the same input produces a different sensation. It's like the brain is constantly interpreting based on the whole picture, not just the isolated piece. Okay, let's step back and see how this theory relates to the giants on whose shoulders we stand. One way to show a theory is powerful is to show it can explain older, seemingly distinct theories as special cases. Think of it like showing that Newton's laws are just a simplified version of Einstein's relativity at low speeds. First up, Berkeley's ideas about spatial vision. He talked about coordinating different senses and even synesthesia to build our sense of space. Our theory says that's just one specific way sensory qualities are determined, coordinating inputs. Next, James Lange's emotion theory. The idea that we feel afraid because we run away, not the other way around. Our framework can reinterpret this as a specific instance of how bodily states are classified and contribute to emotional experiences. Then there's Helmholtz. He stressed how experience shapes perception, arguing sometimes it's hard to tell what's direct sensation versus learned interpretation. His idea of unconscious inference, using past experience to interpret ambiguous stimuli, is remarkably close to our view. Interestingly, he insisted on a pure core of sensation untouched by experience, which paradoxically makes his own emphasis on experience's overwhelming importance seem almost like support for our position, albeit unintentionally. Continuing with the historical sweep, there's the reproduction psychology school: Erdmann, Dodge, Henning, Schumann. They were obsessed with residues, lingering traces of past experiences that determine current sensations. They were getting close to our idea, but they still kept a strict separation between the raw stimulus component and this residue. Our theory blurs that line more completely. What about the Gestalt folks? Their focus on how we perceive wholes, like shapes and patterns, is similar to our broader application of configuration principles to all sensory experiences. We see our approach as a way to extend Gestalt insights consistently across the board. And what about the old associationists? They believed everything mental comes from connections forged by experience. We agree. We trace mental processes back to experience creating connections. But here's the key difference. We don't think the elements themselves are mental. They are material events, nerve impulses. It's only through the connections we forge between them that they organize into the meaningful, mental-like patterns we experience. It's the connections that create the meaning. Let's wrap up the historical connections. James Mill, John Stuart Mill's father, had a fascinating idea. He suggested similarity could just be a special case of the law of frequency. Things that appear together often get linked. A bold move towards reducing principles. Sadly, his son dismissed it, and the idea didn't really take off. Later thinkers like George Henry Lewes picked up on this thread, but their work hasn't gotten the attention it deserves. Finally, a crucial point. Our theory offers a clear way to understand mental events that aren't conscious. For the first time, perhaps, it gives a systematic structure to the unconscious. This opens the door to potentially integrating various theories about the unconscious mind, providing a framework for stable knowledge in that domain. It's like finally having a map for uncharted territory. Okay, enough looking back. Let's look forward. How can we test this theory experimentally? Not necessarily with one magic bullet experiment, but by suggesting directions where experiments might yield interesting results. The core idea to test is this. Can we change the qualities we perceive simply by changing the connections between sensory impulses? If yes, then amazing possibilities open up. We should be able to, in principle, teach people to consciously feel sensations they previously couldn't, or to distinguish between stimuli they previously found indistinguishable. Even stranger, maybe we could create entirely new sensory qualities, things nobody has ever experienced before. Think about that, inventing a new color or a new smell through training. That's the kind of radical claim this theory implies. Does this sound completely outlandish? Well, there's some evidence already. We know practice drastically improves discrimination. Blind people develop incredible tactile skills. Professional wine tasters can detect nuances most of us miss. Musicians have finer pitch discrimination, artists better color perception. These aren't innate differences necessarily, but acquired skills. This supports the idea that learning can sharpen our sensory distinctions. The Gestalt work on perceptual organization also hints that experience reshapes how we see patterns, suggesting variability might extend even to basic qualities. However, there are gaps. Much discussion still suffers from what William James called the blooming buzzing confusion, the idea that there's some raw, uninterpreted data out there, and perception just organizes it. Our theory says no, the organization is the data. Also, studies on people who gain sight later in life, like Senden subjects, show they learn gradually, but they seem to distinguish colors right away. This complicates things for our specific predictions about creating entirely new qualities from scratch. What about more direct evidence? Consider the classic experiments with perceptual inversion. People wore glasses that flipped their vision upside down or distorted it. Initially disorienting, but after weeks they adapted. The world seemed upright again. How? By learning new associations, new ways to interpret the flipped or distorted signals in relation to other cues. P.T. Young's pseudophone did something similar with sound, transposing frequencies between ears, and people adapted too. William James himself pointed out that practice improves discrimination because repeated attempts lead to different associations that help distinguish the stimuli. So the link between learning, association, and perception change seems strong. Yet, surprisingly, systematic research specifically targeting how practice enhances sensory discrimination is scarce. Even the concepts themselves, what exactly is practice here? What does improved discrimination mean beyond reaction time? Remain fuzzy. It feels like we're scratching the surface of something deep. Why is this area underdeveloped? Maybe because we intuitively grasp practice differently for different skills. Repeating a movement makes you faster, smoother, that's clear. But why does repeatedly trying to tell apart two similar sounds suddenly make you able to? It's less obvious. The traditional view struggles here. It assumes the sensations are always there, like static on a radio, and practice is just about tuning the receiver better to pick out the signal. But our theory flips it. Acquiring a new discrimination isn't just tuning the receiver, it's fundamentally changing the signal processing. It means creating a new distinction in the phenomenal world. If you couldn't tell red from scarlet before, and now you can, you haven't just tuned your eyes. You've created a new quality, scarlet, distinct from red. These aren't pre-existing sensations waiting to be accessed. They emerge from the learning process itself. So, when we talk about learning new qualities, what do we mean? These new distinctions won't be totally alien. They'll relate to qualities we already know, perhaps similar to red or different from blue. But they represent genuine steps in the hierarchy or spectrum of qualities, extending what exists. The word discrimination itself can be misleading. It sounds like recognizing objective differences, like telling apart two different objects. But our theory pushes beyond that. It's not just about interpreting a given sensation better, it's about changing what counts as a given sensation in the first place. People often talk about physiological limits to discrimination, like hitting a ceiling based on receptor sensitivity. But what are these limits? Are they truly fixed? Our theory suggests the only real limit is that identical physical inputs must produce identical effects if everything else is the same.
Unless you buy into the specific energy theory,
Which claims fibers are dedicated to specific senses, there's no reason why we couldn't learn to assign different qualities to the same type of nerve impulse coming from different places, or even different qualities to identical impulses, arriving at different times or contexts. Let's clarify what learning discrimination really means in this context. It's about assigning different effects, different qualities, to different stimuli, regardless of how physically similar they are. It's about carving up the phenomenal world in new ways. Now, a caution: a newly learned distinction might not always be helpful. If you train yourself to see a specific pattern in noise that rarely occurs naturally, it might become a distraction later. But the core idea remains. The experimental goal is clear. Can we consciously register impulses we previously ignored? Can we make two previously identical feeling stimuli feel different? The method? Force the issue. Use conditioning techniques to deliberately link those initially indiscriminate stimuli to a rich tapestry of other sensory inputs or emotional states. Give them a unique signature, a distinctive set of connections, different from the other stimuli they were previously grouped with. If we can do this, we should see the emergence of new discriminability. How would we actually do this? Well, we'd need subjects who can tell us what they're experiencing. Animals are tricky here. Can a dog tell you if it suddenly started perceiving a new quality? Probably not. We need verbal reports to confirm whether someone was previously unaware or simply couldn't distinguish. So human subjects seem essential. What about vision? It's our most sophisticated sense, heavily trained. Trying to change its fundamental organization might require immense effort. But wait, vision is also imperfect. Lots of different light mixtures produce the same color sensation. Maybe the central processing allows for learning new color distinctions. Who knows? Olfaction smell seems more promising. In civilized life, we don't use it as much as our ancestors probably did, so maybe its potential for learning is greater. Practice effects on smell discrimination are huge, especially early on. The downside? We barely understand the nature of olfactory stimuli or receptor sensitivity. It's a trade-off. So, if we go with olfaction, what kind of experiment could we try? The idea is to take pairs of smells that people initially can't tell apart and force them into different contexts. Use conditioning to link one smell to a rich set of associated stimuli, maybe certain sights, sounds, smells, or even emotions, consistently presented under specific conditions, say morning relaxation. Link the other smell to a completely different set of associations under contrasting conditions, like afternoon excitement outdoors. The control group would have both smells presented under identical circumstances. If our theory is right, the experimental group should start distinguishing the two smells much faster than the control group. We could even leverage synesthesia. If someone hears colors, maybe we could train their pitch discrimination extremely finely, and then test if they can now distinguish odors linked to those pitches. It's a bit speculative, given our ignorance of the proximal stimuli, but it's the most promising avenue suggested here. Beyond satisfying curiosity, could this have practical uses? Potentially, yes. Trained senses could have real-world applications. Of course, the simplistic approach outlined here is likely too crude. We'd need a much deeper understanding of how different sensory dimensions interrelate before we could reliably engineer new perceptions. But let's dream bigger. What about internal stimuli? Signals from within our bodies. Could we make previously unnoticed bodily signals conscious? New techniques like diathermia might offer clues. And could we expand our senses? Maybe push beyond the currently accepted visible spectrum or audible range through intense training. Those weird anecdotes, like someone claiming to smell colors, shouldn't be dismissed outright. Finally, consider reflex senses. We have balance mediated by the inner ear, a kind of reflex sense. Maybe we have others, responses to specific internal or external cues processed at lower levels, but never linked to conscious qualities because they didn't co-occur with distinctive patterns. Could we deliberately associate these signals with rich, unique experiences to bring them into consciousness? It's a tantalizing possibility. Okay, let's flip the coin. What could go wrong? What alternative theories, if proven true, would directly contradict ours? First, let's ignore the untestable stuff like dualism. Now consider Simon's idea of the engramma, the memory trace stored within individual cells. If this theory holds, and if whatever is stored inherently carries the differentiated attributes of the original sensation, then our whole classification network idea is toast. It would mean the problem we're trying to solve is solved by something else entirely. A more direct refutation would come from the specific energy theory, specifically the illegal interpretation we discussed earlier. If we discovered that different types of nerve fibers physically transmit different kinds of properties corresponding directly to sensory qualities, then the idea that qualities arise purely from classification and connection patterns would be undermined. It would suggest the code is built into the cable itself. Are there more modern challenges? Yes. Take Weiss's resonance theory applied to outgoing impulses. It suggests it's the character of the impulse, not the specific pathway, that triggers similar impulses elsewhere. If this proved true for incoming sensory impulses too, it would challenge our emphasis on the pathway and the network structure. Similarly, some contemporary Gestalt theorists emphasize the spatial configuration of impulses, regardless of which specific fibers carry them. If that's confirmed as the dominant factor, it would also shake our foundations. Lastly, there's the idea that sensory discrimination is solely determined by peripheral motor events. While motor responses are undoubtedly important, it seems highly unlikely that they could completely replace the need for central classification and symbolic processing, the core of our theory. These alternatives represent potential dead ends for our approach. All right, let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture, the philosophical implications. If our theory is correct, it fundamentally changes how we think about knowing the world. It implies that the very machinery we use to perceive reality, our cognitive apparatus, is itself shaped by a kind of experience. This apparatus isn't blank slates. It's modeled on the environment we inhabit, representing a generic reproduction of the relationships we've encountered before. We interpret new events through this pre-existing framework. What does this mean philosophically? It means we can't talk about pure sensation anymore in the old sense. It forces us to confront some deep questions about the nature of experience and knowledge. The heart of this philosophical shift lies in the role of experience, what we call pre-sensory experience or eslabonamientos, those prior links. By emphasizing this, our theory does something radical. It eliminates the need for a hypothetical pure core of sensation. No longer do we need to posit some direct, unmediated communication of object properties or irreducible mental atoms. These ideas, while historically influential, were ultimately vague and untestable. By showing that even the most basic sensory qualities are constructed through experience-dependent classification, our theory dissolves many of the philosophical puzzles that arose precisely because of the ambiguity surrounding these supposed pure sensations. It offers a more coherent, empirically grounded starting point. So, wrapping up this section, this theory presents a compelling narrative where mental life, from simple discrimination to complex thought, emerges from the dynamic process of neural classification. It makes testable predictions about brain function, learning, and perception, and it reframes our understanding of both historical theories and the philosophical basis of experience itself. It's a framework that invites further investigation and challenges us to rethink the very nature of perception.